The wedding night has always been dressed in silk and sanctity, painted as a union of souls, a moment of tenderness, a holy covenant sealed under the watch of God and community. But beneath the hymns and the laughter, beneath garlands of roses and the clinking of goblets, there was another truth, one whispered in shadows, one soaked in fear. Imagine the silence of a stone chamber. The air is cold, lit only by trembling candlelight. A girl, sometimes no older than 12, is led forward draped in fabric too heavy for her small frame. Her husband, often decades older, waits with a face hardened by power, wealth, or war. What follows is not a consummation of love, but a ritual of control, a public contract written on a private body. The medieval wedding night was less about intimacy, more about property, the transfer of a womb, the stamping of lineage, the sealing of alliances behind locked doors. What was celebrated in feasts outside became a theater of cruelty inside, where virginity was not a treasure, but a trial by ordeal. Bloodstains on linen were not only expected, but demanded, paraded as proof of purity. Failure to perform could lead to annulment, disgrace, or worse. The day of marriage began with music, lutes and bells, the laughter of children, the rustle of silk veils caught in the wind. To those who gathered, it was a festival of joy, the promise of union, the sanctity of love wrapped in ritual. Bread was broken, wine poured, hymns raised to the heavens. Beneath the vaulted stone arches, the crowd whispered prayers for fertility, for blessings, for a future secured. But beneath the sound of celebration, silence clung like incense, a silence heavy with expectation, with scrutiny, with the sharp edge of judgment. For the bride's worth was not measured in laughter, nor in beauty, nor even in the alliances her body would cement. It was measured in blood, in secrecy, in the fragile membrane of flesh hidden from the light. Virginity was not a private state of being. It was a public currency, guarded by fathers, bartered by kings, consumed by husbands, watched over by priests. And the veil that covered her face was more than fabric. It was a shroud, hiding the tremor in her breath, concealing the truth that what awaited her was not freedom, but trial. She walked forward as if into a holy sanctuary, but beneath the embroidery of her gown lay the knowledge that she was already judged. The feast and the dancing, the songs of merriment, were all but theater. Behind the smiles was a quiet cruelty, a pact unspoken but universally understood, that the girl at the altar was not a soul to be cherished, but a body to be proven. The church blessed her with sacred words, and the congregation nodded in reverence, but what truly mattered would happen far from the public gaze, when the doors were bolted and the chamber hushed. The medieval world wrapped its brutality in beauty. A white sheet became a relic, a bloodstain a holy sign, and the pain of a young bride was recast as divine necessity. The veil was not simply lifted, it was stripped away like innocence itself, and though songs of praise rang in the hall, the bride's silence spoke louder, an unchosen silence, enforced by fear, by obedience, by the weight of eyes watching even through closed doors. For while the veil was lifted only once, its shadow remained forever. Women carried it across their lives, stitched into memory, into shame, into the unspoken grief of generations. They were told they entered marriage adorned in purity, when in truth they were bound in silence. Silence before the feast, silence on the wedding night, silence in the years after, when obedience became their second skin. The bridal veil, so delicate in appearance, was heavy with betrayal. It concealed not the bride's beauty, but the cruelty she was not allowed to name. And so the music played on, the goblets overflowed, the priests prayed over the union, while within her heart the truth remained veiled, that love had no place here. Only proof, only pain, only silence. The feast was loud, but the bride was silent. Around her the hall shimmered with torches and laughter, with men toasting one another as if kingdoms themselves had been conquered. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the rafters, mingling with the sweetness of spiced wine. Yet in the center of this triumph sat a child, her small hands buried in folds of cloth too heavy for her frame, her eyes lowered, her mouth pressed shut. She was the prize at the center of the bargain, though no one spoke of it that way aloud. Marriage was celebrated as holy, but in truth it was currency. Land changed hands, titles secured themselves, grudges were softened by the binding of flesh. Behind every blessing uttered by a priest, there was the clinking of invisible coins, the mapping of estates, the measuring of heirs not yet conceived. The bride's body was the parchment on which such contracts were signed, her womb the ink that sealed them, and no matter her age, no matter her trembling, no matter the weight of fear settling in her stomach, the bargain would be honored. She may have been 12, scarcely old enough to understand what was happening, or perhaps 14, plucked from childhood games and thrust into a chamber where men debated her dowry as if discussing the harvest. The groom could be twice her age, his hair already streaked with grey, his hands rough with war or swollen with indulgence. To him she was not a companion, but an inheritance. She was a key, opening doors to wealth, to alliances, to power that stretched across generations. The vows spoken at the altar were not hers. They belonged to the fathers, the uncles, the lords who clasped hands in agreement while her own fingers remained limp. She was traded with blessings, sanctified with ritual, yet beneath the fragrance of incense lingered the truth. She had been sold, her price was written in acres, in livestock, in castles whose stones would outlive her own fragile body. For the bride, there was no illusion of choice. She had been prepared since birth, raised not to imagine a life, but to serve as the bridge between two names. Her laughter as a child had meant little, her prayers even less. What mattered was the unbroken line of obedience that carried her from her father's home to her husband's chamber. What mattered was her silence, her compliance, her body ready to bear the future of men she barely knew. And so she sat beneath the gaze of strangers, her face lowered beneath a crown of flowers, her cheeks burning not with joy but with dread. The music swelled, the hall cheered, yet she was absent within herself, watching as if from a great distance, for she was not entering a union, but a transaction. She was not a bride, but a gift passed from one hand to another, a coin struck in living flesh. The cruelty was not shouted, nor written in decrees. It lived in the softness of voices blessing the couple, in the pride of fathers watching their bargains fulfilled, in the careless laughter of guests who feasted on her fear as though it were invisible. And when the night fell, when the candles burned low and the revelry quieted, the silence would return, heavy as iron. For all the music, all the blessings, all the wine, none of it could mask the truth. A child had been sold, and the world called it sacred. The night was never truly private. Doors closed, torches dimmed, and guests retired to their quarters, but expectation lingered like smoke through the stone corridors. The chamber was heavy with silence, save for the slow breath of the groom, the crackle of a dying candle, the faint rustle of fabric against bare skin. And somewhere beyond those walls, the crowd waited. They waited not for tenderness, not for intimacy, but for evidence. A marriage was not sealed with vows or rings, but with blood. The linen spread across the bed was no mere cloth. It was an altar. Upon it, a bride was expected to bleed, her body offering a visible sacrifice that proved her untouched purity. The red mark on the sheet was more than flesh breaking. It was property transferred, lineage secured, honor preserved. Without it, everything trembled. Alliances, inheritances, reputations. The girl knew this before she ever entered the chamber. From whispered warnings, from mothers who spoke in riddles, from the tight hands of attendants who dressed her with shaking fingers. She knew that her body must not only endure, but perform, that the stain was her shield, her proof, her survival. And so the night was not hers. It belonged to fathers, to husbands, to those who waited outside, imagining her body as testimony. But the body does not always comply with the myths imposed upon it. Some brides did not bleed, some bled too little, or not at all, and when the sheet was carried out in the grey morning light, unstained, the silence of the crowd grew sharp and dangerous. Murmurs rose like a storm. Accusations followed. Innocence was not measured by truth, but by spectacle, and without the crimson sign, suspicion became law. The shame was public. Families who had boasted of their honor were now forced to defend it. Women were examined, humiliated, questioned as if their very existence were a crime. They could be cast aside, annulled, disgraced, abandoned to a life of whispered scorn, for the stain was not just proof of virginity, it was the thread holding together fragile webs of power, and when it failed, all eyes turned on the bride, demanding to know why her body had betrayed the bargain. Some tried to cheat the ritual. Servants slipped drops of animal blood onto the cloth. Mothers instructed their daughters in tricks of deception, desperate measures to satisfy a hunger for proof that was never about truth. But such illusions were dangerous. Discovery could lead to ruin, to punishment, even to death. And still the ritual persisted, repeated across generations, turning every bridal chamber into a courtroom, every marriage night into a trial. The girl herself had no voice. She was reduced to a mark on fabric. Her humanity dissolved into a crimson blot demanded by others. Her fear, her pain, her silence, all erased, replaced with the cold logic of honor and shame. She lay awake long after the night's ordeal, staring into darkness, listening to the faint crackle of the hearth, knowing that her life had been measured and judged not by her spirit, but by the blood she could not control. In the end, the sheet was folded, carried through doorways, displayed like a banner of triumph or disgrace. And while guests murmured their judgments, while fathers and husbands exhaled in relief or clenched their teeth in fury, the bride herself remained behind, exposed, hollow, unseen, for what had been demanded of her was not love, nor choice, but proof that she had entered the chamber untouched, and proof that she had left it marked. A life reduced to linen, a future written in stains. Night was supposed to draw a curtain, but here it only pulled the crowd closer. In some halls, the bridal chamber was never truly sealed. Servants lingered just beyond the threshold. Priests muttered prayers under their breath. Lords and kinsmen pressed their ears against the oak, waiting for the proof that the marriage had been made real. The chamber was filled not only with candlelight, but with unseen eyes. The consummation was not always private. In certain courts, the ritual was performed with witnesses nearby, as if the most intimate act between two people were a play staged for an audience. Some nobles demanded that attendants escort the bride and groom to their bed, watching as the garments were removed, piece by trembling piece, until the couple lay exposed beneath the sheets. For the act itself was not theirs. It belonged to the world outside, to the families who demanded heirs, to the church that demanded proof, to the whispers of onlookers eager to be satisfied. For the bride, there was no refuge. She was stripped of secrecy, her body transformed into theater. Every gesture was heavy with fear. Every sound echoed against walls that were never truly hers. She knew the weight of footsteps in the corridor, the faint scrape of laughter stifled behind a hand, the pressure of expectation bearing down upon her skin. What should have been tender was made brutal by intrusion. What should have been private was dismantled by ritual. Even when the door was closed, the crowd's presence lingered. Outside, the guests drank and laughed, but they were listening. They waited for the groan of the bed, the whispered cries, the clumsy fumbling that proved the act was complete. The couple inside became performers without rehearsal, their exhaustion and fear devoured by the anticipation of others. And when silence stretched too long, when no sound emerged from behind the chamber door, suspicion spread like smoke through the hall. The bride's body was no longer hers. It was evidence, it was spectacle, it was stagecraft demanded by a hungry audience. Some brides trembled so fiercely they could hardly move, their tears swallowed in the dark. Others hardened themselves, becoming stone, enduring the intrusion as one endures the lash. Yet all were bound by the same cruel expectation, to transform their first night into a drama for the world, to bleed and suffer on command, to become proof of purity and fertility under watchful eyes. There were stories whispered in corners, of attendants peering through cracks in the wall, of chamber doors left ajar so that witnesses might hear, of priests recording the act in hushed tones as though chronicling scripture. Nothing was sacred, nothing untouchable. Flesh was displayed, innocence consumed, shame paraded as entertainment. And when morning came, the sheets were lifted, the proof displayed, and the crowd applauded as though justice had been served. The bride, however, could not escape what lingered. She carried in her memory the weight of eyes that were not there but were everywhere. She carried the humiliation of being made a spectacle, of having her pain turned into performance. And though the night ended, its echo remained, that her body was never her own, that her marriage began not with union but with invasion, that her very soul had been conscripted into a theater of cruelty. For the crowd it was a ritual to be repeated, a tradition to be celebrated, a story to be retold at feasts. For her, it was an erasure. She was not a wife, not yet a mother, not even a woman in her own right. She was an object in a ceremony, a figure on a stage, a sacrifice displayed for the satisfaction of others. And long after the candles burned down and the laughter faded, she remained in the chamber, shivering in silence, knowing the world had entered with her and would never leave. The spectacle was over, but the shame endured. The night ended, but judgment did not. Dawn crept through the shutters with a pale, merciless light, and still the chamber's silence lingered like a wound. For not every body bled, and not every body obeyed the cruel script written for it. Flesh does not always honor myth, and when it failed, the punishment fell not on superstition, but on the bride. She might have lain awake through the long hours, her body trembling, her soul hollowed, waiting for blood that never came. She may have felt the linen beneath her thighs, cold and unmarked, and known in that instant that she was already condemned. For the world did not understand anatomy, did not allow for chance, did not believe in variance. A woman who did not bleed was not innocent. She was accused, her body had betrayed her, and so her worth collapsed in silence. Whispers came first, soft, poisonous, curling through corridors. The sheet was lifted, inspected, found lacking. Guests muttered behind goblets of wine. Fathers averted their eyes, husbands clenched their jaws in quiet fury. The bride herself was dragged before questions sharper than blades. Had she been touched before? Had she deceived them all? Was the bargain spoiled? The honor shattered? The lineage endangered? Her voice, small and breaking, meant nothing. The absence of blood had already spoken louder than she ever could. There were examinations cruel, invasive, humiliating. Old women sent to probe her body, midwives commanded to judge what could not be judged. The very parts of her most hidden were dragged into the open, searched for answers they would never yield, and as they prodded, whispered, and condemned, the girl's identity dissolved. She was not a person, only a riddle to be solved, a vessel accused of deception, a body that would not obey its masters. Sometimes violence followed. A bride cast aside, her marriage annulled, her dowry disputed, her name erased from memory as if she had never existed at all. Others remained in their marriages, but lived branded with suspicion, their loyalty doubted, their chastity mocked. Every glance from their husbands carried the weight of disappointment. Every silence between them echoed with mistrust. And all because their bodies had not delivered the red mark, demanded by cruel tradition. Even those who bled were not free. Too much blood, and they were cursed as weak, fragile, tainted. Too little, and they were judged with suspicion. Their bodies could never win, for the rules were written not in flesh but in fantasy. The myth of purity was heavier than the truth of skin, and women bore that weight in silence, punished for what they could not control. The cruelty of it all was hidden behind prayers and rituals, behind the quiet assurance that this was the way of things. Yet for the girl who sat weeping into her hands, staring at unstained linen, there was no sanctity in it. Only shame, only dread, only the crushing knowledge that her life had been measured in drops of blood that never fell. And so she was left with silence. The silence of her own body refusing to speak in the way the world demanded. The silence of being disbelieved, of being condemned, of being reduced to nothing more than absence. She carried that silence with her, long after the torches were extinguished and the feast was forgotten. For in the end, the body itself had become her enemy, her betrayer, her undoing. And the echoes of that betrayal would follow her into every breath, every glance, every shadowed corner of her new life. The bells of the church tolled above every marriage, their iron tongues declaring holiness, while shadows stretched across the earth. It was said that the union of man and woman was a sacrament, a sacred mystery reflecting heaven itself. Yet for the bride, the holiness was heavy, suffocating, pressing down on her like the weight of stone walls and stained glass. The church blessed her, yes, but it also chained her. In hushed sermons, priests spoke of purity as though it were light itself, fragile, radiant, easily extinguished by sin. A woman was told she carried within her not only her body, but the honor of her family, the future of her lineage, the very image of divine order. To stumble, to fail, to bleed wrongly, or not at all, was not merely a personal flaw, it was an offense against heaven. Her flesh became a battlefield between sin and sanctity. Her silence, a commandment enforced, not by love but by fear. Confessionals filled with brides who whispered their dread into darkness. They spoke of nights when they felt nothing but terror, of husbands whose touch was a punishment, of beds that felt like altars upon which they were sacrificed. And still the priest on the other side of the wooden screen murmured prayers of obedience, reminding them that their suffering was sanctified. Pain was redefined as piety, silence as virtue, endurance as grace. The church did not stand outside the bridal chamber, it entered with them, unseen but absolute. Its hand rested on the husband's shoulder, urging him to claim what was his by holy right. Its gaze lingered on the bride, reminding her that to resist was sin, to cry out was shame, to refuse was rebellion against God himself. And so the weight of the crucifix hung in the chamber as heavily as the expectation of blood on linen. She prayed, because she was told to pray. She whispered to the Virgin, hoping that the Mother of Sorrows understood what she could not say aloud. She begged for mercy, for tenderness, for deliverance from the trial her body must endure. Yet even in prayer she was reminded that obedience was the highest offering, that silence was her virtue, that her body's suffering was to mirror Christ's own. Every wound she carried was transfigured into doctrine, and every tear shed was gathered not as protest, but as proof of devotion. But holiness did not ease her shame. Instead, it sharpened it. For what the world demanded of her was not only obedience to a husband, but submission to the divine order itself. Her terror was rebranded as duty, her dread as sanctity, her brokenness as sacred offering. To resist was not merely to defy a man, but to defy the church, to defy the God whose name was invoked over every vow, every sheet, every silence. The shadow of the church stretched long, consuming not just the night of marriage, but the years that followed. A wife who was struck was told to endure. A wife who was neglected was told to pray harder. A wife who wept in loneliness was reminded that her sorrow was her path to heaven. And so the silence deepened, not just within the chamber, but within the soul. For beneath the bells and prayers, beneath the sermons and blessings, there was a darker truth. The church had sanctified not the tenderness of union, but the cruelty of obedience. It clothed suffering in holiness, and in doing so, it made silence eternal. And in that silence, countless women disappeared. Not all voices vanished. Beneath the weight of obedience, beneath the heavy stones of ritual and silence, there were murmurs quiet, almost imperceptible, but alive. They were not cries of rebellion shouted in the open air. They were whispers carried in secret between women who knew the cost of being heard. Sometimes resistance began with silence itself, a refusal so subtle it seemed like compliance. A bride might feign illness on her wedding night, stalling the ordeal with trembling hands pressed to her chest. Another might weep so fiercely that the chamber fell into uneasy quiet, her husband unnerved by the rawness of her grief. Small deferrals, fleeting evasions, yet in them lived the fragile seed of defiance. There were those who sought escape within the law's narrow cracks. Annulments whispered through corridors, petitions to clerics framed in the careful language of piety. A husband deemed too cruel, a marriage left unconsummated, a union declared void by divine decree. Rare victories, fleeting respites, but each one proof that the chains, though heavy, could sometimes be pried apart. Others resisted with deception. Mothers passed down secret knowledge, how to stain linen with animal blood, how to feign the trembling innocence demanded by watchers. Servants conspired in shadows, slipping into chambers with hidden vials, shielding their mistresses with small, desperate lies. It was not rebellion with swords, but rebellion with stains and whispers, survival disguised as obedience. Even in the cloisters of the church, some dared to twist the very language of faith into armor. A woman might confide her suffering to a sympathetic confessor who cloaked her resistance in holy words, reframing endurance as martyrdom, painting her refusal as divine chastity rather than disobedience. In this way, silence became weapon, sorrow became shield. Yet the cost was immense. Those caught in deception were ruined. Those who sought annulment risked disgrace, and those whose whispered refusals grew too loud were crushed beneath the weight of law, of family, of holy wrath. Most never spoke again. Still, their whispers remained. Faint echoes passed from mother to daughter, lingering beneath the songs sung at feasts, carried in glances exchanged during weddings, tucked within lullabies sung to infants who would one day be veiled. These acts did not overturn the order of things. They did not unmake the cruelty or silence the bells, but they mattered. For within a world that demanded compliance at every breath, even the smallest refusal was a form of survival. Even the faintest whisper was a crack in the stone. And so, in darkened chambers, behind bolted doors, within the folds of veils and linens, resistance lived on, quiet, fragile, easily extinguished, yet alive. It was not freedom. It was not victory, but it was a reminder, however faint, that obedience was not absolute, that silence could hide more than despair. The world did not hear these women, but they heard each other, and sometimes that was enough to endure. Time did not erase the chamber. It only changed its walls. The rituals shifted, the garments altered, the hymns softened into different tongues, but the weight endured, the expectation of purity, the demand for obedience, the silence of the bride. These lingered like ghosts, clinging to every generation that followed. The linen was folded and put away, but the idea of proof did not vanish. Families still measured daughters by their untouched state, still guarded them as property waiting to be exchanged. A girl's laughter was still shadowed by the thought of what she owed. Her worth still bound to blood she could not control. The night of her wedding still loomed before her, a trial cloaked as celebration, an ordeal renamed as blessing. The echoes of those first nights stretched beyond the chamber, seeping into law, into song, into whispered custom. Tales of dishonored brides became cautionary warnings. Songs praised the chaste maiden, cursed the woman who dared to be otherwise. Silence was inherited as surely as dowries. Daughters learned to lower their eyes, to still their tongues, to obey, and the chain carried on, link by link, through centuries that pretended to change but never truly did. Even when the church's grip loosened, its shadow remained. Sermons that had once sanctified obedience continued to shape hearts, reminding women that their worth lay not in their voices, but in their purity, in their suffering, in their silence. And men, raised on those same sermons, carried forward the belief that obedience was holy, that domination was duty, that marriage was less a bond of souls than the possession of flesh. 1,000 small rituals carried the echoes forward. Veils lowered over faces, fathers giving daughters away as though they were gifts, feasts that celebrated alliances rather than love. And always, always, the silence of women who knew what was expected of them and dared not break it. The theater of the wedding night may have shifted in form, but its cruelty endured, haunting even those who never set foot in a medieval hall. The echoes reached across oceans, across languages, across centuries. They lived in villages and palaces, in churches and courts, in chambers lit by candlelight and in rooms where lamps hummed with oil. They lived wherever women were told that their worth was measured in obedience, wherever brides walked forward in gowns heavy with more than fabric. Even now, the echoes stir when vows are spoken, when veils are lifted, when brides are told to obey. They linger in the silence of ceremonies that still carry traces of transaction, in the unease of women who feel history's hand on their shoulder, even as they smile through feasts. The medieval chamber is gone, but its shadow remains, etched across centuries of silence, whispering that what was demanded once can still be demanded again. And so the cruelty lives on, not as spectacle, not as ritual, but as memory. A memory heavy enough to shape lives long after the sheets were stained, folded, or burned. A memory that does not fade, because it was never only about a night. It was about control, about silence, about the transaction of flesh disguised as love. And memories, unlike linens, cannot be washed clean. Yet, silence is never truly empty. In the void left behind, you can almost hear them. The breath caught in the throat of a girl walking to her wedding bed. The muffled sob in the darkness. When the linen stayed white, the prayers whispered into pillows, into walls, into the hollow space where no one listened. These are not the sounds of celebration. They are the sounds of erasure, carried across centuries like wind through broken stone. The forgotten brides live in absence. They live in the shadow of feasts, where no one remembered their terror. They live in the hymns that sanctified their obedience. They live in the laws that bound their bodies to men they never chose. And though they left no testimony, their suffering is written in silence deeper than words. Some endured, some broke, some disappeared altogether. But together they formed the unseen foundation of the world that celebrated their silence. Their pain built dynasties, their obedience secured alliances, their bodies carried the weight of generations. And still, history rarely speaks their names. The veil remains the perfect symbol. It hid their faces in life, and it hides their voices in memory. They are buried beneath it still, not in the earth, but in the indifference of time. Yet if you look closely, if you listen in the stillness, you can sense their presence. A shadow in the chamber, a stain on the linen, a silence that refuses to fade. They are the forgotten brides. They were told to obey, to submit, to vanish, and they did. But the echo of their suffering endures, haunting the halls of history, demanding to be felt even if never spoken.